Welcome back to Bad Things in History, where we find that sometimes there's a thin line between good, evil, and practical. Today, when most people think of World War II, it is assumed that Germany was a force for evil. By contrast, the United States is often portrayed as heroic in its effort to free Europe from the iron grip of Hitler. Reality is messy, and it doesn't always agree with expectations. Today we are going to tell you the story of a German submarine commander who tried to do the right thing, and in response, the United States committed a war crime. RMS Laconia. Before commercial air travel existed in the early 20th century, people who traveled abroad did so on the ocean. Tourism was popular, and an entire industry was created to accommodate them. England was one of the first places to begin building ocean liners designed to carry paying passengers across the Atlantic Ocean. The RMS Laconia was one of these ocean liners. It was built in 1921. In January 1923, the ship began the first ever around-the-world cruise. The journey took 130 days to complete and set a new world record. RMS Laconia also had a habit of finding itself in dangerous situations. On September 8, 1925, not far from Nantucket, Massachusetts, the cruise ship collided with a schooner. Nobody was seriously hurt, and RMS Laconia towed the damaged vessel to safety. In September 1934, the ship encountered heavy fog off the coast of New York. Because of low visibility, the ocean liner plowed into the side of a freighter. Nobody was killed, but both of the vessels were damaged. RMS Laconia continued carrying passengers until 1942, when it was requisitioned by the UK government and converted to a troop ship. The former ocean liner had guns installed on the deck and was modified to carry troops, prisoners, and equipment. It still crossed the Atlantic Ocean on a regular basis, but now the ship had to worry about German submarines, and it wouldn't take long for RMS Laconia to find them. The attack. Rudolph Sharp was born in Scotland in 1886. He came from a long line of seafarers. Rudolph spent his life on ships, eventually working his way up to captain. On June 17, 1940, he was in charge of the RMS Lancastria. It was a cruise liner that had been confiscated and converted into a troop ship. The vessel was helping to evacuate British citizens and soldiers from France. During an air raid, a plane dropped 3 bombs on the Lancastria, after which it began sinking rapidly. Many of the lifeboats had been damaged, so most of the survivors couldn't escape. Rudolph Sharp survived the sinking of his ship. However, as many as 7,000 people may have drowned during the disaster. Rudolph never forgave himself for not doing more to save the passengers. On the night of September 12, 1942, Rudolph was in charge of RMS Laconia. There were 2,372 people aboard. A little over 1,700 of them were Italian prisoners of war, though civilians and soldiers were also on board. The ship was carrying the prisoners from Cape Town, South Africa to Freetown, Sierra Leone. It would never arrive. Werner Hartenstein was the captain of U-156, a German submarine. He was off the coast of Liberia when the RMS Laconia was spotted. Since there were guns on the deck, Werner assumed it was a valid target. He gave the order, and 2 torpedoes were fired at the ship. Both of them hit their target. Heavy listing made half of the lifeboats inaccessible. During the chaos that followed, many of the Italian prisoners were abandoned and left to drown in their cells. Several escaped and tried to force their way onto lifeboats. Soldiers killed them with bayonets. Rudolph Sharp wasn't willing to repeat his past mistakes. He did everything he could to ensure that the women and children were placed into lifeboats. Then he walked into his cabin, locked the door, and went down with the ship. As Laconia started sinking, U-156 surfaced. This was something submarines usually did to try and capture senior officers. What they found instead was over 2,000 people struggling not to drown. Germany to the rescue. Werner Hartenstein realized that the passengers of the ship he just destroyed were mostly civilians and prisoners. He ordered the crew to raise a Red Cross flag, which Werner believed would stop the submarine from being a valid target for enemy attacks. He then began trying to rescue the stranded passengers. Werner also sent a message to his commanders asking for help. Admiral Karl Donitz then ordered 7 other submarines to help with the rescue efforts. For those who had spent a life at sea, leaving innocent victims to die was unthinkable. However, when Adolf Hitler was notified of the situation, he became furious. He wanted the rescue operation to stop. Werner Hartenstein was ordered to meet with other submarines that would take on the survivors he rescued. French ships under the control of Germany would also try to help. In the meantime, Werner Hartenstein crammed his submarine full of survivors. Several lifeboats were being towed behind the submarine, and the remainder were standing on the deck of the submersible. Werner also spoke perfect English. He broadcast the following message, hoping that Allied forces would assist him and refrain from attacking. "If any ship will assist the shipwrecked Laconia crew, I will not attack her, providing I am not being attacked by ship or air force. I picked up 193 men." For the next 2 days, U-156 continued to rescue passengers. Other ships, both Allied and Axis, also joined in the effort. Meanwhile, British intelligence had received Werner's messages, but it was suspected that the rescue effort might be an enemy trap. The British informed United States commanders that RMS Laconia had been sunk. They neglected to mention that the event happened 2 days ago and the rescue was still in progress. On the morning of September 16th, a B-24 Liberator bomber spotted U-156. The bomber had just left a secret base on Ascension Island. The pilot could see the numerous passengers and Red Cross flag. Werner also sent a message to the bomber asking for assistance. The bomber pilot turned away, then contacted his commander. Captain Robert C. Richardson was the senior officer on duty. Captain Richardson was worried that the Germans might discover the secret base on Ascension Island and attack it. He also didn't think submarines were allowed to fly Red Cross flags, so he ordered the bomber pilot to attack. The bomber turned around and then dropped several bombs and depth charges on the submarine. One of them exploded near the lifeboats and killed dozens of survivors. Werner ordered the people on the deck of the submarine to jump into the water. Then U-156 submerged and escaped the Allied attack. Meanwhile, the B-24 believed it had destroyed the submarine. They were later given a medal for its destruction. As far as the survivors, most of them waited for other ships to arrive, but 2 lifeboats decided to make their own way to Africa. Both of the boats were lost at sea until they were discovered weeks later. Werner and his crew were no longer part of the rescue mission, but other submarines were, and the United States hadn't finished attacking them yet. The last attack. After attacking U-156, Captain Richardson assumed more submarines were in the area. He ordered the B-24 to continue searching for new targets, which it did for the entire night. Additionally, the B-25s launched from Ascension Island joined in the effort. The following morning on September 17th, one of the B-25s saw several lifeboats from Laconia. They notified a British merchant ship, which changed course to rescue them. In the meantime, the B-24 saw another German submarine, U-506. There were 151 survivors on board, including several women and children. The B-24 dropped 2 bombs and 2 depth charges on the submarine. It dived below the surface before the explosions could damage it. Later that day, the British sent a message to Ascension Island informing them that French ships were en route to help rescue Laconia's passengers. Since France was now occupied by Germany, Captain Richardson assumed this meant the French were going to invade Ascension Island. He called off the submarine hunting missions and prepared to defend his base. The rescue efforts continued until September 20th. The RMS Laconia was traveling with 2,741 passengers. Only 1,083 of them survived. At least 96 of the victims were left drifting in the ocean after the attacks. They died while waiting for rescue. The attack on the submarines had far-reaching consequences for the war. Prior to the sinking of RMS Laconia, submarines would traditionally surface after an attack. In addition to looking for senior officers to capture, they would provide the survivors food, water, medical care, and a compass. That changed on September 17, 1942. Admiral Karl Donitz issued what became known as the Laconia Order. From that point forward, German submarines were no longer allowed to rescue anyone. War crimes. Werner Hartenstein would meet his own end just a few months later. On March 8, 1943, U-156 and its crew were off the coast of Barbados. Depth charges dropped from a United States PBY Catalina aircraft exploded, breaking the submarine in 2 and killing everyone on board. Karl Donitz would briefly become president of Germany. On May 1st, 1945, about a day after Hitler killed himself, Karl became the head of state for what was left of Germany's government. 7 days later, he surrendered to the Allies. Then on May 23rd, the German government was dissolved and Karl Donitz was arrested. During the Nuremberg trials, he was charged with 3 violations. One of them accused Karl of participating in a war crime by issuing the Laconia order. However, the tribunal received a surprising letter. Admiral Chester Nimitz from the United States Navy supported his German counterpart. Nimitz claimed that the United States Navy did exactly the same thing with Japan in the Pacific theater. The tribunal chose not to find Karl guilty of unrestricted submarine warfare, but he was imprisoned for 10 years on other charges. The incident was revisited by the Naval War College several years later. Their conclusion said, "The person who issued the order to attack and the aircraft commander who carried it out are both prima facie guilty of a war crime. The conduct of the aircraft commander appears to be entirely inexcusable since he must have observed the rescue operation. During the time that they are engaged in such an operation, enemy submarines are no longer lawful objects of attack. The fact that the U.S. Army Air Force took no action to investigate this incident, and that no trials took place under the then effective Domestic Criminal Code, the Articles of War, is a serious reflection on the entire chain of military command." Captain Rudolph Sharp's sacrifice was also not forgotten. In 2009, his descendants traveled from Australia to Scotland. They were given a medal honoring Captain Sharp's valiant sacrifice. Who was really guilty of a war crime? Was it the German submarine commander who attacked a ship full of civilians and prisoners? Was the United States the real international criminal here? Or is war a horrible and messy affair that just doesn't make much sense most of the time? Tell us what you think in the comments below. Like this video if you want to see more stories like this in the future, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.